Hi everyone and welcome to a new video on the CBI channel. In this tutorial series, we're creating a calendar inside of our Django and React application. This is not the first video in this series. In fact, we've already done 4 before, in which we've completed a basic setup. I showed the different views that FullCalendar has to offer. We've taken a look at how we can display our database data on our calendar, and we've also given different events on our calendar different colors. In this video, we're going to continue and we're going to make sure that we can add a multi-select filter on our calendar so that our events on our calendar can be filtered. Now, to do that, we're going to be following 5 steps. We're going to start by doing some installs for Material UI. Next, we're going to be adding a Material UI select form to our project, which we're going to be using to filter out the events. Then we're going to parameterize the form and display it on our calendar page, and then filter the events based on the selected things inside of the form. And as the last step, we're going to be testing the results and see if everything works correctly. Now, similarly as the previous videos, I've already created a new file for my calendar 5, which has the end result of the previous video. And I've also added a calendar 5.jsx page right here, which matches the calendar 4 from previous. So we can continue where we left off. Now, the first step that we're going to take is installing some packages from Material UI. And Material UI is a components library which allows us to use ready-to-go components inside of our code. And this can save us quite some time. Now you can see here in the documentation on mui.com/materialui that there are a few installs mentioned right here. And we're going to install these inside of our project. So I'm going to copy over this command right here. And inside of our code, we're going to open a new terminal. Now we want to install this inside of our front end. So I'm going to cd into front end and in there do the npm install of those packages. And our install is now complete without any vulnerabilities. So now we're able to use Material UI components inside of our code, which is going to make our life a little bit easier. Now, to make sure that we can filter the events of our calendar, we first need to actually have a form that we can use to do the filtering with. And we're going to get that from Material UI. So on the documentation, I'm going to go to Get Started. And on the left menu, you can see an item for components. Now in here, you've got a whole bunch of stuff that you can use, but we are interested in the select fields. Because what I want to do for this one is have a multi-select field that users can use to filter the items in our calendar. So now when we scroll all the way down, we will see a few options for multiple select. We can have default option, which works like this. We can also have stuff with chips in there or even with placeholders included. But what I want to use is the one with the check marks. And it's going to show up something like this. Now, to add this inside of our project, we can click on Show Code, and then we're going to select the option for JavaScript, because that's what we use for programming here. And I'm going to copy over the full source code that we see right here. Now, inside of our project in Visual Studio Code, I'm going to add a new folder inside of the components folder. And I'm going to be calling that forms. And inside of that form, I'm going to create a new file called multiselectform.jsx. And in here, I'm going to paste in the full code that we just copied from Material UI. And I'm going to rename this multiple select checkmarks to multi-select form. Like so. And just like that, we would be able to use this inside of our project to display a form on our page. Now, before we're actually going to do that, I'm going to add some parameters to this form because I want to make sure that everything in our code is reusable and that we don't need to completely configure this for every form that we're going to render. So the first thing that you notice is that the label of our form is called tag. And if we go to the example right here, you can also see that right here, that tag is the name of this form. but I want to make sure that it's a parameter so that we can specify the name of the form separately. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add some squirrely brackets in the word tag, and then I'm going to call this label, because this is going to be a parameter that we can specify later on. Now I'm going to copy it over and also specify it right here, because over here it also mentions the label tag. Now on the top, we can enter some squirrely brackets inside of our MultiSelect form function, and also specify that this function takes in the parameter of label. And that way we can use the label parameter to give our form a name. Now you can also see right here that it's displaying a bunch of hard-coded names. And those represent the options inside of the form. Because if we go back here, you can see those names represented over there. But what we want to do is we want to pass in our own information, and we don't want to have that hard-coded. So I'm going to delete everything from constant names, and I'm going to create a parameter for options. Now, of course, names is used in this code below here as well. So I'm going to do a Control F and look for names. And you can see right here that we loop over the names and create an item for every name in the list. Now we want to do the same thing, but for the options. So I'm going to replace names with options, because that's the name of our parameter on the top right here. And I'm also going to change the .map name to option. And then everything right here, every value that's called name is going to be changed to option. And let's save this. And just like that, we should be able to give our own options to this form and also change the title of the form by using the label parameter. Now let's try to display this form on our calendar 5 page. So I'm going to go to calendar5.jsx, and the first thing that I want to do is import the form that we've just created. So on the top, I'm going to do import and then MultiSelect form from forms/MultiSelect form. Now, ideally, what I would like to do is to put it on top of the calendar that we have right here, and also make sure that they're a little bit separated. Now, to arrange that, I actually want to put them in separate boxes, which is a Material UI component as well. So what I'm going to do right here is I'm going to do box. And this is also automatically importing box from MUI/material. So don't forget to also include that right there. And inside of this box, I want to put my form. And because we potentially will have a lot more forms, I'm going to create different boxes for different forms. So let's say that we want to create 3 forms in a row. We can do box here and also have 2 boxes underneath it, like this. Now, inside of this first box, I can put in the block and say that I want to have the MultiSelect form in there. Now, if you recall from what we just did, the MultiSelect form expects us to mention a label, and it also expects us to mention some options for that label. Now, in our particular case, I want to filter our calendar on the statuses. So in here, I'm going to state that label is going to be equal to status. And for now, I'm going to say that options is going to be equal to just an empty list, because we don't have those options right now. Now, what I would also like to add to this piece of code is a little bit of styling, because I want this piece of code to be clearly separated from what is going on right here. So the first thing that I'm going to do is inside of this top box, I will do SX and then an equal sign and then 2 times the squarely brackets, which is a way to style your components individually. And in there, I'm going to say that the box shadow can be equal to 3, which is going to put a little bit of a border on our box. I'm also going to say that the padding can be 20 pixels, which is going to make sure that we have a little bit of room on the outside. And I will say that display is equal to flex. and that justify content is going to be equal to space evenly. Now what this does is this is going to make sure that when our box gets smaller, the items are moving with it. And the justify content says that we want to space all of the items below it evenly. Now the last thing, what I also want to add is a margin bottom. And we're going to say that that is going to be 20 pixels. And this will make sure that there is a margin of 20 pixels before we arrive at our calendar. I also want to make sure that the calendar has a little bit of the same styling. It doesn't need to have everything, but I want it to have some of the same. So I'm going to copy over this box right here and just put it right here as well. And then let's also copy over a closing tag. And then we need to make sure that the closing tag is, of course, after our calendar is finished. And I'm just going to keep the box shadow free and the padding of 20 pixels. The rest can actually go. So now let's start our server and see what we encounter. So I'm going to start the front-end server by doing npm run dev. And because we also want to display the data from our backend, I'm also going to create a separate terminal and then start our backend server. And we do that by doing cd into our backend folder. Then we can do venv/scripts/activate to make sure that we've activated our virtual environment. And then we do python manage.py run server. And everything is running now. So let's see what it looks like inside of our browser. And our server has now started. And if we take a look at what our calendar 5 page looks like, you can see that we have now a status form on the top with a nice box right here. And also our calendar is inside of this box. Now, the first thing that I would like to change is make sure that it's a little bit more to the left and that the boxes have each their own width. So what we will do is we're going to go back to our code. And inside of our calendar 5, we're going to be adding some SX to our box, where we state that the width of this box is going to be 30%. Now I'm going to do this, but also for the other 2 boxes that are currently empty. Otherwise, they will not be spaced nicely. So I'm just going to do it like this. And now when we are back in our front end, you can see that it's positioned a little bit better than before. Now you can see that currently we don't actually have any options on display right here. And that is because we entered an empty list. So now let's make sure that this form actually displays the statuses that we also get inside of our events. And if we go and inspect and go to our console, you can see that this is the data that we retrieve from our Django backend. And in there, the status is reflected in a field called class names. You can see here it's for one event open, and we also have in progress and completed. So what I want to do is I want to take the class names field, create a unique list of the class names, and use those as the options inside of our form. To do that, we go back to our code, and in here, we're going to create a new constant. And this constant is going to be called status options, and then set status options. And that's going to be equal to use state. So now we have a variable that we need to populate with all of the unique statuses. And we can actually populate it in the same way that we populate our events. But what we need to do is make sure that we only get the values from the column class names and that we get the unique ones and not the duplicates in the list. So after our set events, I can do set status. And in there, we can then put some square brackets and then do 3 dots and specify new and then set with a capital. And then we can do some round brackets and type in some logic on the data that we want to get to our status. Now, in this case, we want to do res.data. And this basically means the data that we receive from this API call. And now we want to do dot map. And in this map, we're going to add another round bracket and say event. And then after the event, we do an arrow function like this. And we say that we want to see event dot class names. And what this does is it's going to create a new set of all of the data from the column called class names. And this should generate a unique list. Now the set status options is going to put this information inside of our status options. So if we now use status options inside of our options, we should see a unique list of all of these statuses. So let's put that in here, save it, and see if we now actually see that data inside of our form. Now, when we do this, we actually get an error. And I think what is happening is that our return statement right here tries to get the status options before our API has actually populated those status options inside of our variable. So what we can do to circumvent that is put in some logic that evaluates whether we are done with loading the data. And I've also done this in some previous tutorials already. So what we can do is we can simply put in a constant, and we're going to call this one loading and the other one set loading. And by default, we can define this as use state. And in here, our default value is gonna be equal to true, which means that at this moment, loading is always true. Then inside of our return statement, we can say that we only want to display this whole block right here if our loading is actually false, because that's when we know that we are done. So what I will do is I'm going to put in some logic here. So we do some squarely brackets and put the bottom one on the bottom of our code like this. And everything inside of these squarely brackets needs to be in one block. So I'm also going to do this and make sure that everything is in between these characters. So it's going to think that it's one block. Now inside of this statement, I will define that if loading is true, then I'm going to display a p tag. And in there we say loading the data. Because if we are still loading, I just want to display that that is happening. And now we can use a colon to say that if we are no longer loading the data, so we have everything that we need, then we want to display all of the stuff right here. Now what we can now do is go to our API and we can say, okay, if you have set the events and if you have set the status options, so all of this is populated, then we want to say that we're no longer loading. So then we can do set loading, and we can say that set loading is going to be equal to false because we are no longer loading. Now let's go to our front end again in the browser and see if we still get an error. And you can now see that our errors have been solved, and inside of status we now get a unique list of all of the statuses that we have. So that is quite nice. So now that we have the form on our page, which displays all of the unique statuses, we actually need to make sure that our events are going to be filtered based on that statuses. Now, what we want to achieve is that events are being filtered by the value of our MultiSelect form. So the first thing what we're going to do in the calendar5.jsx file is we're going to create a constant which needs to display all of the selected status options. So in here we do constant called selected status, and we can change that by using set selected status. And this is going to be equal to use state. And as a default value, we're going to pass in an empty list. Now what we want to do is we want to populate the selected status variable by using set selected status, which should take the value of our form and put it in there. So to do that, we can create a new parameter for our MultiSelect form called set selected value. So inside of our multi-select form, we're going to be creating a new parameter, and in there we say set selected value. And what this should do, it should pass the value from our form to our calendar5.jsx. And right now inside of our multi-select form, we're using person name and set person name to determine the actual value of our form. And we are actually wanted to do the same thing, but we also want to set the selected value to that particular value. So what I will do is inside of this handle change command, we're also going to put in set selected value and open it up with some round brackets like this. And in there, we're going to do exactly the same thing as what we did for set person name, because we're just going to populate the set selected value with the actual value of the form. So let's save this and let's see how this now works. Now, ideally, every time we make a change to our form, the set selected value should be triggered. And this should take the latest lists of all of the value that have been selected. Now we pass this through the parameter to our calendar 5. And in here, in the multi-select form, we can then pass that value to the selected status one. So in here, we can say that set selected value is going to be equal to set selected status. Now what this will do, it will take the values from our form and pass those into the set selected status variable. And that then enables us to know which statuses we have actually selected. So let's do a console.log. And in here, we can put in the selected status so that we can constantly see what happens when we click a different status in our form. So we are now back inside of our front end, and let's click on inspect and go to our console. And you can see right now that the array is 0 because we've not selected anything. So now if I click on open, you can see that our calendar creates the open value inside of the list. And the same goes if I click on in progress or on completed, because it's constantly being logged right here. And we now know with every click of the button which statuses should be included from the events. So now that we know exactly which status is selected at what time, we can create a constant that filters those events based on those values. So inside of our code right here, we're going to create another constant, and this constant is going to be called filtered events, because we want to filter our events based on those conditions. And in here, we can state that we want to do events.filter. And in here, we open some round brackets and do event and then an arrow function. And let's just open it up like this. Now, what we want to do is we want to make sure that our events are being filtered on the values from selected status. So we do selected status dot includes, and then we do event dot class names. And this makes sure that our events are being filtered, and it's being filtered on the list of selected statuses that need to be inside of the column called class names. Now, to see if this actually works, we can change the events inside of our calendar to the filtered events. And that should hopefully tell us if this works or not. So let's change the events to our filtered events and see if things are being reduced when we use our form. Now we are now back in our front end, and you can see that if I don't select any of the check marks, we don't see any data inside of our calendar. But if I select open, the appointment 3 appears. And same goes if I now click on completed, you will notice that our appointment 4 appears again. So it actually works the way that we expect. Now, this is still not really perfect because there are two things that are lacking here. I don't have the option to select all of the different events at once, so I need to do them one by one. And if I now reload the page, it even throws an error right now. So let's start with troubleshooting this error. If I right click on the screen and I click on inspect, I can go into the console, and in there we see that it cannot read the properties of undefined reading filter. Now if I click on the top file right here, you can see that the problem is in the constant of the filtered events. And if we go back to our code and we're going to go to the calendar5.jsx page, you can see that we're here trying to filter the events. However, it's probably already trying to filter events before events have even been loaded by our API. So a very simple way to make sure that this is still going to work is to pass in an empty list with two of those square brackets inside of the useState function right here, because that's going to say that the default value of events is going to be an empty list. So if we now save this and go back to the browser, it should be okay. And when we now return to our browser, you can indeed see that our calendar is rendered on the screen again, and I can select the different statuses to make the events appear. So for the next task, let's make sure that by default, all of these statuses are selected as the value inside of our calendar. Because if I now reload this page, you will notice that the default behavior is to not show any of the events because status is not populated. But we want to already set the value to everything before we get to the page. Now to do that, we need to make some changes to both our calendar 5 and our MultiSelect form. Because what we want to do is we want to make sure that when we make our API call, we set the selected statuses immediately to all of the statuses that are available. And that is actually quite easy because you can just copy over the set status options. But instead of setting the status options, we can also set the selected statuses to all of the unique statuses that we have inside of our data. So if we do it like this, by default, this list of selected status will have everything in there. Now, if we now go back to our browser, you can indeed see that by default, all of our events are now present because the selected status list, which we use to filter down the events, says that everything is there. However, also all of the values inside of our form must be checked. Otherwise, it will not look nice for the user. And to realize that, we need to make sure that we can pass the selected status as the value inside of our MultiSelect form. And we can do that by adding another parameter to our form. So inside of our MultiSelect form, I'm going to add another parameter, and we're going to say that this is going to be called selected value. And now we're going to be replacing our value with this selected value so that from the calendar 5 page, we can highlight what the values should be when we render the page. So right now we can copy over selected value and set the value to selected value. Now previously this value was set at person name, which means that our form is only going to work if we replace person name everywhere by the selected value. So I'm going to do Ctrl F and look for person name. And you can see that we use it firstly inside of our checkbox. So this is now going to be set to selected value. And we're also using it right here where we set the actual value of our form, and also right here in the constant of person name and set person name. Now we can delete the person name and the set person name because we're not going to be using that anymore to determine the value. Also, we can delete this set person name right here, and we actually don't need to make any change to this set selected value thing because it is going to work if we set it up like this. The last thing that we now need to do is we need to go back to the calendar and make sure that our form includes this parameter of selected value. So let's copy that and go to calendar 5 and add another attribute or parameter to our form. And we're going to set selected value equal to the list that has all of these selected statuses. So we're going to copy over selected status and put that in right here. Now, the way that this works is actually a little bit inside of a circle. At the beginning, when a user comes at the page, the API request will set all of these statuses in the selected status list through the set selected status, which means that this one has all of the values that we want inside of our form. Then we let our form know what the values in the form should be by saying that selected value actually needs to be equal to all of our statuses. When we then go to the MultiSelect form, you can see that the selected value passes that to the actual value of the form, which in our checkboxes make sure that all of those checkboxes for selected value are going to be checked. Now, every time we make a change in this form, so the user clicks around inside of our form, the handle change is going to cover the other way around. Because in there, it's going to make sure that every time we click it, that all of the values that are selected are being brought back to that list in calendar5.jsx, but this time through the set selected value parameter. Because if we go to calendar 5, you can see that the set selected value is actually going to write back to this list again. So this list is determining both the values that we see in the events, but also the value in our forms. So it actually goes both ways around. So let's make sure that all of our files are now saved, and let's see what this looks like inside of the browser. So we're now back in our browser, and if I reload this page, you will see that both our form has all of the options selected, and also our calendar displays all of the events. And if I now say that I don't want to see open, it also works the other way around, where the events disappear if I deselect the status. Now, the last thing that I would like to add is to also have an option on the top here that is going to enable the users to select or deselect all of the different options. So kind of a select all button. Now, to do that, we only need to make a change to our MultiSelect form. And the first thing that we're going to do in there is we're going to add another menu item on top of the options one, and that is going to be fully dedicated to the option of select all. So inside here, we are going to create a menu item, and in here we want to do a few things. The first thing what we want to do is we want to set the value not equal to option, but we're going to set it to a value of a text, which is going to be all. Now, the next thing what we want to do is we want to determine the behavior of the checkboxes. Now, what we want to do is that if all of the values are selected, then we want to have the checkbox completely checked, but we also want to have some kind of an indicator for when the other options are partially checked. So let's say 2 out of 3 are checked, then we want to display it with a little bit of a minus. So the first thing that we're going to do right here is we're going to set the behavior of the checkbox. That means when there's going to be a check inside of that checkbox. And that checked value is going to be equal to selected value dot length. So this is going to check the number of values that we have selected. And we want that to be equal to the options dot length. Now this evaluates if the number of the things that we've selected is equal to the number of the things that we can select. And by doing that, we can determine if it is checked or not. Now, what I just mentioned is that we would also like to have another option right here for when things are partially selected. So when we've selected like 1 or 2 of our 3 options. Now, to realize that, we can add another setting inside of checkbox, which is called indeterminate, like this. And over there, we need to evaluate whether we've selected some options, but not all. And we can do that by doing selected value dot length. And that one must be more than 0 because we want it to be partially selected when we had selected at least something. But we also want to do an end statement and make sure that the selected value dot length is less than the total amount of the options dot length. And by doing it this way, we can determine that some are selected, but not all. Now, inside of the text, we don't want to display option, but I want to have the text saying select all. And this is going to be the label that we actually see inside of our form. So let's save this and see what it looks like. So right now, if I open this, you can see that we have a select all field. And you can see that if I select one item, it shows a minus, which is caused by the indeterminate setting. And if I select all three, you can see that it becomes a checkbox because now we've selected everything. Now, if we now use select all, it doesn't actually do anything yet. And that is because we still need to add some logic in the onChange state. So when we go to our code and go a little bit up, you can see right now that we only handle the change for the set selected value, which is nice, but we also want to add some actions to this menu item right here for when we have selected all. And we can do that by creating a conditional statement. So we can say right here that if the value dot includes all, then we want to have some logic for the menu item that is going to check everything. And we're evaluating the word all because that is what we've set as the value of this item. Now, if we have indeed added the value of all inside of the statement, we want to make sure that either all the options are immediately being selected because we want to see everything, or that none of them are being selected because we've already had everything and we just want to deselect everything. So in here, we can say set selected value because we want to change the values. And in there, we can do a conditional setting of the value. So we can say that if the selected value dot length is equal to the options dot length, which means that we've selected everything already that is inside of the options, then we just want to make sure that our selected values are empty. And we can do that by doing these square brackets. However, if the selected values do not match the total number of options, we want to select everything. So we can just say that the list needs to be all of the options right here. Now, we of course also have cases where the value does not include all. So I'm going to do else and then do some of those parentheses as well. And then we just use our normal behavior where we add the value of the thing that we've selected to the list and pass it back to our calendar. So this should make sure that if we've selected everything already, nothing is selected, and otherwise we select all of the options. And we are now back inside of our code. And you can see that if I now click on select all, it should deselect everything, which it does. And if I now select all because nothing is selected, it also selects everything. And the same goes for a partial selection. If I now click select all, it will also select everything. So it works exactly the way that we expect. And that is actually all that we're going to be doing in this video. In this video, I show you how you can add a multi-select filter on your FullCalendar. In the next video, we're going to continue and we're going to make sure that we can also filter on date ranges. And that makes sure that we can limit the events based on dates and also that we can see how we can add multiple filters in our calendar at once. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.